There is a generalized lack of awareness of the historical roots and conflicts Indigenous people had and continue to face in society. As a result, poor policy decisions, racial attitudes, and civic distrust has caused mass separation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations. Of greater concern is the detrimental effects this dissociation from society has had on the health and well-being of Indigenous people. Within this presentation, we are hoping to provide you with some insight into the history of colonialism, the impact it has had on Indigenous health and well-being, the current Indigenous healing practices being used, as well as ways you can help that contributes to reducing the stigma and promoting Indigenous inclusion in society. There is an undying need to build a better future. However, to do so, one must look to and learn from the events that unfolded in the past. In the early 1600s, Indigenous people welcomed the arrival of European settlers in their communities. They began to work in partnership with one another. However, little did the Indigenous people know, the Europeans had other intentions in mind. They were more interested in inexpensive natural resources, lands, and new sources of wealth. This led to the initiation of European control, which is commonly known as colonialism. Indigenous communities were stripped away of their land and sent to reserves. They were forced to abandon their language, education, and traditional values, customs, and practices. They would become civilized once they embraced the European lifestyle, language, government, and health practices. The colonization of Canada relied on the belief that the original inhabitants were inferior. Over the years, this constructed inferiority of Indigenous people has and continues to influence stereotypes that perpetuate discrimination against this population. As such, Indigenous people face barriers, specifically within healthcare, that has resulted in a loss of traditional healing practices, lack of access to services, negative care experiences, which can include not being welcomed, abuse, racism, lack of quality care, as well as poorer health outcomes. Many initiatives have taken place to address the health challenges Indigenous people experience in Canada. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has opened a national dialogue that reflects on the anti-Indigenous racism through the perspective and experiences of Indigenous people. The Commission's call to action addresses these systemic challenges by urging all levels of government to work together to identify and close the social and economic gaps. Its focus is to inspire trust and healing between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and bring forth a process to renew relationships that are built on inclusion, mutual understanding, and respect. In addition, recent mandates have been made from Health Quality Ontario to implement equity measures specifically within hospitals. This creates greater incentives to address the barriers to accessibility that Indigenous people often face within healthcare. These movements are just the beginning to abandoning the past prejudice and mistreatment against Indigenous people. However, gaps still remain in the knowledge, skills, and attitudes of healthcare providers to adequately address the problems, including attitudes informed by anti-Indigenous racism.
Residential schooling began in Ontario in 1831. It existed for well over a century, where in that time approximately 150,000 Indigenous children attended. Due to such a vast length of time in which these residential schools operated, it has impacted generations and led to extensive intergenerational implications within Indigenous families and communities. Residential schools were adopted in order to reform Indigenous children into the Euro-Christian Canadian society. In order to do so, children were taken away from their families, and it involved the breaking of any ties or linkages to their culture, their families, furthermore eradicating their language, culture traditions, and spiritual beliefs. The true reality of the ongoings of these residential schools was not privy to Canadians until survivors shared their experiences. The children who attended these schools endured physical, sexual, and mental abuse, with many of them dying while living in the schools. Subsequently, this historical trauma has greatly impacted their mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual health. Studies have shown direct links to the prevalence of health inequities in Indigenous communities, such as increased substance abuse, mortality, suicide rates, criminal activity, disintegration of family and communities, and mental health illnesses to residential schooling. One study revealed that 98.4% of their Indigenous participants who had been affected by residential schooling, whether it was themselves or a family member, all experienced mental health issues such as PTSD, substance use disorder, and depression. This set of effects has been labeled residential school syndrome. The high prevalence of substance and drug abuse, as stated by Indigenous individuals, is used as a coping mechanism to deal with their past historical trauma. Furthermore, the high suicide rates demonstrate the hopelessness that many Indigenous individuals still internalize. We need to understand that the harmful effects of the residential schools have resulted in a loss of self-pride and self-respect for many Indigenous communities, and further drives the desire for reconciliation, which requires a new vision based on commitment to mutual respect that must be developed.
The disparities in health outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians has been a concern for quite some time. On this slide, the most concerning statistics relating to Indigenous people and their mental health are highlighted. It is worth noting that suicide and self-inflicted injuries are the leading cause of death for First Nations youth and adults up to 44 years old. The fact cannot be ignored that these disparities have been perpetuated by a history of colonization and the system of residential schools that dismantled Indigenous culture, tradition, and language and led to a process of alienation, displacement, oppression, and marginalization. It has been suggested by the Public Health Agency of Canada that poorer socioeconomic circumstances and social exclusion can entrench feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, alienation, and mistrust among vulnerable populations, and can increase the likelihood of adopting unhealthy or risky behaviors.
Health, healing, and wellness for Aboriginals is a balance of emotion, mind, body, and spirit to achieve harmony with family, nature, spirituality, and community. Traditional healing ceremonies promote wellness by reflecting on the spirit, creator, and the universe through prayer, chants, drumming, songs, stories, and the use of sacred objects. Healing circles are community discussions with a leader, facilitator, or elder in which members express their feelings and concerns. Sweat lodges are used for purification and healing rituals, as steam is created to sweat out toxins and impurities. Smudging is a cleansing ceremony to rid a person or place of negative thoughts and feelings, purify the soul, and bring the mind to clarity by igniting the four sacred medicines. Signifying the connection of well-being, nature, spirituality, and community, the medicine wheel is a sacred item used by Indigenous tribes for health and healing. Associating with the four directions of the medicine wheel, tobacco sits in the eastern door, sweetgrass in the southern, sage in the western, and cedar in the northern. These sacred medicines are primal in all traditional ceremonies. Logan et al. 2020 sought to identify the value and support of Indigenous healing practices within the Canadian healthcare system following the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and Calls to Action reports. Their study emphasizes the necessity for learning reinforcements and further reconciliation in medicine to empower Indigenous patients and provide Indigenous patient-centered care.
Indigenous people have faced many challenges in the past, and they still face many challenges today, including discrimination within healthcare systems. This is especially prominent in central Canada, where there have been reports of Indigenous people being ignored in emergency departments and Indigenous women being coerced into sterilization. Issues of racism and discrimination will not be solved until the system is changed so that healthcare is delivered in a way that is culturally competent. One way nurses can build trust and form lasting relationships with Indigenous patients is to commit to providing culturally safe care. Implementing culturally safe care requires that the patient's way of knowing and being is respected as valid, that the patient is a partner in healthcare decision-making processes, and that the patient determines whether or not the care received is culturally safe. Reflecting on one's own biases and stereotypes is a core skill that facilitates the development of culturally secure relationships. An approach to this is to recognize and challenge stereotyping in everyday life. Healthcare professionals can start by asking themselves these questions. What is your perception of Indigenous people where you currently live and work? Where did you get this information? And can you identify any potential biases or stereotypes in the source of this information? Thank you for listening to our presentation. We hope that it has informed you on how to address the stigma towards mental health and the discrimination of Indigenous people within healthcare.